Ryan slams the front door harder than he intended. The thud echoes in the quiet night, amplifying the tension that has hung between him and Clara for months. His footsteps are heavy as he makes his way to the car, mind racing. Inside the house, Clara is left standing, arms crossed, her face etched with frustration. She doesn't shout after him, she's done shouting. They've had this fight 100 times before, and it always ends the same way, Ryan retreating, Clara left to pick up the pieces. The air inside the car feels suffocating. Ryan grips the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He's tired. Of everything. Of work, of responsibility, of the crushing weight of fatherhood. He pulls out his phone, opens a photo of his newborn daughter, Sophie. In the picture, she's peaceful, wrapped in a blanket, her tiny face untouched by the chaos surrounding her. She doesn't deserve this. But that thought doesn't bring comfort. Instead, it digs deeper into his guilt. What kind of father feels nothing but dread when he looks at his child? Ryan shoves the phone into the passenger seat and starts the engine. His headlights cut through the darkness as he drives with no destination in mind. He can't go back. Not tonight. Hours pass. The city fades behind him, replaced by empty roads and the sound of his own thoughts. The argument replays in his head, Clara's words sharper now than when she first said them. "You're never here, Ryan. Not for me, not for her. You think money's enough?" It wasn't about the money. It was about how everything felt so suffocating. Sophie's birth should have been a new beginning, but all Ryan saw was an endless tunnel of obligations. Clara doesn't understand. Maybe she never will. He pulls into a deserted parking lot, the glow of the streetlights casting shadows through the car. His chest tightens as he sits there, staring at nothing. This can't be his life. Not this. Not a life where he feels trapped, unwanted, inadequate. He looks at the picture of Sophie again, and for a brief moment, the weight on his chest lightens. But it's not enough. He isn't enough. Ryan exhales slowly, his breath fogging up the window. He tells himself that leaving is the right thing to do. Clara deserves better, Sophie deserves better. If he stays, he'll only drag them down with him. Better they start fresh without him. He makes a silent decision, one that feels both terrifying and freeing in equal measure. He can't be the father they need. When he drives off into the night, it's with a sense of finality, as though a part of his life is shutting down for good. Clara wakes up to an unfamiliar silence. She instinctively reaches for Ryan's side of the bed, but it's cold, empty. A knot forms in her stomach as she sits up, listening. The house is eerily still, except for Sophie's soft breathing from the next room. Clara swings her legs out of bed and pulls on a robe, trying to ignore the nagging fear creeping into her thoughts. Ryan's not a morning person. He wouldn't be up without reason. She checks the living room first, then the kitchen. No sign of him. His coat is gone. His keys too. Clara's mind races through possibilities, trying to stay rational. Maybe he needed air. Maybe he went for a drive. But the thought of their fight, the way his face tightened when she brought up Sophie, won't leave her alone. She checks her phone. No message. No missed calls. Her chest tightens with a mix of fear and frustration. She goes back to the bedroom and sits on the edge of the bed, staring at the blank screen of her phone. What was she expecting? An apology? An explanation? He left. He didn't even leave a note. The truth of it settles into her like a slow poison. He's gone. Clara's eyes sting, but she doesn't cry. She can't cry. Not when Sophie is still sleeping in the next room. She clenches her fists, trying to steady herself. They've had rough patches before. He's disappeared into work for days at a time, but this is different. This feels final. Something inside him broke tonight, and she knows it. Hours stretch on. The sun rises, casting a harsh light through the curtains. Clara hasn't moved from her spot on the bed, numbness taking over where anger should be. But beneath the surface, something else stirs, a resolve she didn't know she had. She looks at the empty side of the bed, then at the door to Sophie's room. Ryan isn't coming back, and she has to accept that. She has to be strong, for Sophie's sake. Sophie stirs, and Clara hears her soft coos from the other room. It's time to move. Time to be a mother. She rises, wiping her face with the back of her hand, and walks to Sophie's crib. As she looks down at her daughter, the weight of Ryan's absence feels heavier than ever. But Clara won't let it crush her. She picks up Sophie, cradling her against her chest. "It's just you and me now, baby," she whispers. Her voice is steady, even if her heart isn't. Ryan's routine was always the same. He liked it that way. The order, the structure, it was predictable, unlike the mess he'd left behind a decade ago. Now a pilot, his life was quieter, lonelier, but it worked. He had his flights, his schedules, and the distance he kept from everything else. The only place he ever felt in control was in the cockpit, cruising at 30,000 feet where everything below seemed so far away, so insignificant. Today was supposed to be just another flight. He adjusted his uniform, ran through pre-flight checks, exchanging mechanical pleasantries with the crew. The buzz of the airport outside was background noise, blending in with the hum of engines starting up. His mind was focused, detached. It had to be. The last thing he wanted was for memories to creep in, memories of a life he chose to leave behind. As the passengers boarded, he glanced through the cabin, making his usual observations. A girl caught his eye. She was sitting quietly by the window, legs tucked beneath her, completely absorbed in a book. Something about her was familiar. Her face was soft, framed by dark hair that fell in loose waves. He squinted, a slight frown pulling at his forehead. He didn't know why he paused on her, but there was a tug in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. Forcing himself to look away, Ryan went back to his preparations, trying to shrug off the odd sense of recognition. It had been 10 years. Sophie would be around that girl's age now. Sophie. The name he never said aloud, the daughter he never knew, not really. Shaking his head, he pushed the thought away, reminding himself that he had no right to wonder about her. Hours into the flight, Ryan finally had a moment to catch his breath. The sky was clear, everything was smooth. His co-pilot made a casual comment about the passengers, and Ryan, still distracted, found his eyes drifting back to that girl. Something gnawed at him. She seemed familiar in a way that went beyond just appearance. In a moment of weakness, he did something he hadn't done in years. He pulled up the passenger manifest, scrolling through names with a sense of detachment, until his fingers froze. His eyes locked onto two words that hit him like a punch to the gut: Sophie Miller. His breath caught in his throat. It couldn't be. No, it had to be a coincidence. There were plenty of Millers out there. But Sophie, it was too specific. His chest tightened as he stared at the name on the screen, his mind racing. Suddenly, every memory he'd spent years trying to suppress flooded back. Sophie as a baby, her tiny hands wrapped around his finger. The moment he'd walked out the door, leaving her and Clara behind. Guilt, thick and suffocating, coiled around him. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out the soft hum of the plane. Could this really be her? Ryan's hands shook as he closed the manifest, trying to pull himself together. He glanced toward the cabin again, searching for the girl, his daughter, if it was really her. She was still there, still absorbed in her book, oblivious to the storm raging inside him. What was he supposed to do now? 10 years of silence, of running, and here she was, just a few rows behind him. Fate, coincidence, whatever it was, it didn't matter. The reality hit him all at once. He was so close to her, but they were worlds apart. Could he approach her? What would he even say? "Hi, I'm your dad. Sorry I abandoned you when you were a baby." The thought made him sick to his stomach. His mind warred with itself. He could keep his distance, remain hidden. After all, she didn't know who he was. She didn't even know he was the one flying this plane. He could finish the flight, land, and leave her life exactly as it had been before. He could remain a ghost, an invisible presence she never had to acknowledge. But the thought of doing that felt wrong. He'd already run once, and look where it had gotten him, a decade of guilt, and an empty life. Here she was, right in front of him, and if he walked away again, he knew he would never forgive himself. Yet the fear of her reaction, of seeing hatred in her eyes, paralyzed him. He didn't deserve her forgiveness. He knew that. The minutes stretched on, but the tension inside him only grew. Ryan's throat was dry, his palms clammy as he tried to focus on his duties. He couldn't shake the image of Sophie out of his mind. She looked so much like Clara, her eyes, her expressions. His daughter, grown up without him. What had her life been like? Did she wonder about him? Or did she hate him for leaving? The weight of the question pressed down on him. He thought of Clara too, the woman he had failed, the one who had picked up the pieces after he'd shattered their lives. Had she told Sophie the truth about him? Did Sophie even know he existed, or was he just a shadow in a distant memory? Ryan's hands clenched the armrest as he replayed the moment he'd left, the arguments, the fear of being a father, the guilt that never left him. And now, sitting just a few feet away, was the living consequence of his cowardice. He glanced at Sophie again, heart pounding. She was smiling at something in her book, and it twisted something deep inside him. She looked happy, innocent, completely unaware of the man whose life had been shaped by her absence. Ryan swallowed hard, a decision looming before him. He could let her walk off this plane, never knowing that the pilot flying her across the sky was her father. Or he could take a step, make the choice he hadn't been brave enough to make a decade ago. The turbulence in his chest mirrored the smooth, undisturbed flight outside. He had no idea what he was going to do, but one thing was certain: he couldn't ignore this any longer. Ryan hadn't planned to approach her. The rational part of him screamed to leave it alone, to finish the flight and let Sophie continue her life, untouched by his mistakes. But something pulled him toward her, a force stronger than the years of guilt and shame. Before he could think it through, he found himself walking down the aisle, his steps slower as he neared her seat. She looked up from her book as he approached, her face calm and open. There was no recognition, no flicker of awareness of who he was. It struck him hard, but he forced a smile, leaning down slightly as if this was just a routine check. "Everything okay here?" he asked, keeping his voice casual, even as his heart raced. Sophie smiled politely, her eyes bright. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just reading." He glanced at the book in her lap, his mind scrambling for something to keep the conversation going. "That's a long flight to be traveling alone. Where are you headed?" Sophie didn't seem to mind the question. She closed her book, marking her place with a finger. "I'm going to visit my mom's best friend for a few days. My mom's, well, she's had a hard time lately, so I'm spending some time away." Ryan's throat tightened. The words hit him harder than he expected. He forced himself to keep his expression neutral, but inside, everything was unraveling. Clara was struggling, and here was their daughter, navigating it all with a quiet strength that broke his heart. He swallowed, trying to hold back the flood of emotions. "I'm sorry to hear that. Sounds like you're pretty brave, traveling on your own." Sophie shrugged, smiling faintly. "I've done it before. It's no big deal." Ryan nodded, pretending to focus on the flight, but his mind was spinning. This was his daughter, this girl who had grown up without him, who had learned to handle things on her own. She was polite, composed, and entirely unaware of the chaos her mere presence was stirring inside him. He couldn't resist. "So you're going to stay with your mom's friend? That sounds nice." Sophie nodded again, looking thoughtful. "Yeah. Aunt Sarah. She's been like a second mom to me. My mom's really close to her." The mention of Clara sent a sharp pain through him. He could only imagine what her life had been like after he left, raising Sophie alone, with only friends to lean on. He remembered Clara's strength, her resilience, but he also knew how much she had loved him. How much she had wanted him to stay. The guilt came flooding back, almost suffocating him. Ryan wanted to say something, anything to make the conversation shift away from the heavy ache building in his chest, but Sophie kept talking, her voice soft and steady. "Mom doesn't talk about my dad much. She just says he had to leave. I don't really remember him. She glanced up at Ryan with a small, curious smile. Do you have kids? The question knocked the wind out of him. He froze for a second, caught off guard by the innocence of it. He could feel the words forming in his throat, but they wouldn't come out. How could he explain? How could he tell her that he was her father, the man she had just mentioned, the one who had left? Ryan forced himself to answer. I don't. The lie felt like a stone in his chest, but it slipped out so easily, like muscle memory. He was used to hiding, used to pretending. Sophie just nodded, not seeming to notice the hesitation in his voice. She looked down at her book again, and for a brief moment, Ryan let himself watch her, studying the way she held herself, the little expressions that reminded him so much of Clara. The memories of those early days with Clara flooded his mind, back when everything had seemed simple, before Sophie's birth had thrown everything into chaos. He saw flashes of their old apartment, the way Clara would curl up next to him on the couch, laughing about something trivial. The way they had once dreamed about their future together. And then, the day Sophie was born, the joy in Clara's eyes, the weight of the tiny baby in his arms. He had been so scared then, so consumed by his own fear of failing as a father. That fear had driven him away, but now, looking at Sophie, he realized what he had missed. She was growing up, and he hadn't been there to see any of it. He hadn't been there to hear her laugh for the first time, or see her take her first steps. All those moments had passed without him, and now, here she was, sitting just a few feet away, talking to him as if he were a stranger. Sophie shifted in her seat, bringing Ryan back to the present. She was looking out the window, a thoughtful expression on her face. I always wonder what he was like, she said quietly, almost to herself. I mean, my dad. Sometimes I imagine what he would have been like, you know. But I guess some things you just never know. Ryan's heart twisted painfully. The urge to tell her the truth was overwhelming. He wanted to say, I'm right here. I'm your father star. But the words wouldn't come. He wasn't ready, and he didn't know if she would ever be ready to hear them. Instead, he nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. Yeah, I guess some things are hard to understand. Sophie turned back to him and smiled, not realizing the storm brewing inside him. Anyway, thanks for checking on me. I'm good. Ryan forced a smile in return, his mind a chaotic mess of regrets and what-ifs. As he walked away, leaving her sitting there, he knew he was running out of time. He couldn't hide forever. The decision he'd been avoiding for 10 years was staring him right in the face, and sooner or later, he would have to make a choice. But for now, all he could do was walk away, haunted by the daughter who didn't even know he existed. The plane jerked violently as the turbulence hit, causing the cabin to fill with a collective gasp. The seatbelt signs flashed urgently, and Ryan instinctively gripped the armrests, scanning the faces of the passengers. He spotted Sophie, her hands white-knuckled around the edges of her seat, eyes wide with fear. She was trying to stay calm, but the nervous tremor in her breath gave her away. Without thinking, Ryan stood up and moved toward her, steadying himself against the aisle as the plane continued to shake. He knelt beside her seat, his voice low and steady, trying to cut through the panic. Hey, don't worry. This happens sometimes, but everything's going to be okay. Just breathe, all right? Sophie nodded, her lips pressed tightly together as she tried to focus on his words. He could see the fear in her eyes, a vulnerability that struck him deep. In that moment, she wasn't just a passenger. She was his daughter, and every instinct in him wanted to protect her. He could see the child she must have been, the child he had left behind, now grown into someone so strong yet still carrying pieces of fragility. As the turbulence continued to rock the plane, Sophie's voice came out in a soft, shaky whisper. I hate flying alone. It always makes me feel small. Like no one's there to look out for me. Ryan swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling deep in his chest. He was there, but not in the way she needed him to be. He felt like a coward for hiding, for keeping the truth buried under layers of guilt and fear. I understand. he said, his voice strained. It's tough when you feel like you don't have anyone to rely on. Sophie bit her lip, her gaze dropping to her hands as she fidgeted with the sleeve of her shirt. My mom always says I'm strong, that I can take care of myself. But sometimes I wish I knew more about my dad. She doesn't talk about him much, and I don't even know what he looks like. Ryan's heart stopped. He stared at her, the turbulence outside nothing compared to the storm raging inside him. How could he have left her to feel this way? How could he have chosen to disappear from her life without giving her the answers she needed? I'm sure your father had his reasons, Ryan said quietly, his voice catching. He was fighting the urge to tell her everything, to blurt it all out in one desperate confession. His throat tightened, and he could barely speak. I knew your father, actually, a long time ago. Sophie's head jerked up, her eyes wide with interest. You knew him? What was he like? Ryan's breath faltered, and for a second, he felt like he couldn't do it. He couldn't keep up the charade, but the truth, it felt too impossible to say. He wasn't ready. She wasn't ready. He was complicated, Ryan managed, his voice barely audible. But he cared about you more than anything. Even if it didn't seem like it. Sophie stared at him, searching his face for something, maybe for a clue, maybe for answers she didn't know she needed. Ryan wondered if she could feel it too, that connection between them, unspoken yet undeniable. The turbulence began to ease, and the plane leveled out, but the moment between them hung in the air, heavier than before. Sophie leaned back in her seat, a small sigh escaping her lips as the tension in her body slowly melted away. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook and a pen, flipping to a blank page. I've never really known what he looks like, she said, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. So sometimes I just imagine him. My mom says I'm a pretty good artist. Ryan watched in silence as she began to draw, her hand moving smoothly across the page. With each stroke, she was giving shape to the man she had never met, the man sitting right beside her, hidden behind years of distance and regret. After a few minutes, Sophie lifted the paper and handed it to Ryan. Here, she said, her tone shy but hopeful. This is what I think he might look like. Ryan stared at the drawing in his hands, his breath catching in his throat. The face staring back at him was eerily familiar, a man with soft eyes, strong features, and a gentle smile. It wasn't an exact likeness, but there was something in the drawing that mirrored him, as if Sophie had unknowingly captured the essence of who he was, who he could have been. He looked up at her, struggling to hold back the tears threatening to spill. Sophie watched him expectantly, waiting for his reaction, her innocent hope cutting straight to his core. It's really good, he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. You're very talented. Sophie smiled, satisfied with his response. Thanks. I've always wanted to meet him. Maybe one day, I'll get the chance. Ryan could barely hold himself together. The words hovered on the tip of his tongue. I'm your father, Sophie. I've been here all along. But fear paralyzed him. What if she hated him for leaving? What if telling her now only made things worse? Sophie tucked the notebook back into her bag, unaware of the internal battle Ryan was fighting. She leaned back in her seat, her fingers tracing the edges of the armrest as she gazed out the window, content with the brief moment of connection they'd shared. But Ryan wasn't content. He couldn't be. Every second he stayed silent felt like a betrayal, and yet every time he opened his mouth to speak, the words refused to come out. The drawing still clutched in his hands, he stared at it, feeling the weight of the years pressing down on him. He had been given a second chance, one he didn't deserve, but one that was right in front of him. And yet, the truth was still locked inside him, waiting for the right moment to break free. The plane touched down smoothly, but Ryan's heart was anything but steady. The wheels screeched against the runway as the aircraft slowed, signaling the end of the flight, but for Ryan, the real journey was just beginning. His mind raced, torn between the fear of losing everything and the hope that he might regain something, anything, by revealing the truth. Passengers began to gather their belongings, filling the aisle in slow-moving lines. Ryan remained seated in the cockpit for a moment longer, staring blankly out of the window. His hands gripped the armrests, his knuckles white. He could see Sophie gathering her things, slinging her bag over her shoulder as she prepared to leave the plane. He stood up slowly, mechanically, his mind detached from his body. With each step he took toward the terminal, a voice inside him screamed to turn around, to let her go, to walk away as he had done all those years ago. But another voice, quieter, but steadier, pushed him forward. This was his chance. There were no guarantees, but he had already spent a decade running from the truth. He couldn't keep hiding. As the passengers funneled out of the gate, Ryan saw Sophie's guardian waiting for her, holding a sign with her name. The woman, older but with a kind face, waved at Sophie. Ryan stood at a distance, watching the interaction with a hollow ache in his chest. Sophie approached the woman with a smile, and for a brief moment, Ryan thought about slipping away into the crowd, disappearing again before anyone knew he had been there. But something inside him shifted. He couldn't live with the regret anymore. He couldn't keep pretending. He had to try. With a deep breath, Ryan stepped forward, his feet heavy as if he were walking through water. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as he approached Sophie and her guardian. The closer he got, the more unreal it felt, like a dream he was afraid would shatter any second. He could hear the steady murmur of the terminal, people moving all around him, but all of it felt distant, like he was in his own bubble of fear and uncertainty. Finally, he reached them. Sophie's back was turned to him, her laughter ringing out as she talked to her guardian. Ryan cleared his throat softly, and the woman turned to look at him, her face immediately switching from warm recognition to confusion. Her brows furrowed as Ryan hesitated, trying to find the words he'd been rehearsing in his head but that now seemed impossible to speak. I'm Ryan Miller, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. His throat tightened as he forced the next words out. I'm Sophie's father. The guardian froze, her eyes widening in shock. For a moment, it seemed like she didn't know how to respond. Her gaze flickered from Ryan to Sophie and back again, as if piecing together a puzzle she hadn't known existed. Sophie remained unaware of the tension, still chatting excitedly about her flight. I know this is unexpected, Ryan continued, his voice cracking with emotion. But I want to try to make things right. I don't know if that's possible, or if it's even fair to ask. But I need to try. The guardian stared at him, her mouth slightly open in disbelief. Ryan could see the mixture of emotions crossing her face, concern, confusion, maybe even anger. But she didn't lash out. She didn't yell or call security. She simply looked at him with the same disbelief that he felt within himself. I don't expect forgiveness, Ryan added quickly, his hands trembling as he spoke. But if there's any way, I'd like to see Clara. And Sophie. Even just once. Please. The guardian blinked, clearly taken aback, but after a long pause, she gave a slow nod. I'll talk to Clara, she said cautiously. I can't promise anything. This is a lot. I understand, Ryan said, his voice barely steady. I just thank you. That's all I can ask. She gave him one last glance, still unsure, before turning to Sophie and ushering her away. Ryan stood there, watching them disappear into the crowd, his heart heavy with both hope and dread. Had he made the right choice? Or had he just opened old wounds that could never be healed? Later that afternoon, Ryan found himself sitting on a bench in a quiet park, the one place they'd agreed on if Clara decided to come. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the grass. Children played in the distance, their laughter echoing faintly in the still air, a stark contrast to the tension coiled in Ryan's chest. He sat alone, his hands folded in his lap, staring at the path ahead. Time seemed to stretch and warp as each minute passed without sign of anyone. The longer he waited, the heavier the silence became. He wondered if he had already been answered, if Clara and Sophie weren't coming at all. His mind wandered back to the life he'd left behind, the life he could have had with them. Every lost moment weighed on him like a chain. He thought of Sophie, how she had unknowingly spent the flight next to the man she'd imagined but never known. He thought of Clara, the woman he had once loved but had failed so profoundly. What if they didn't show up? What if they couldn't forgive him? Could he live with that? Ryan's thoughts spiraled, his heart aching with the uncertainty of it all. The sun sank lower, the shadows deepening, and still, no one appeared on the path. But then, footsteps. Ryan's breath caught in his throat as he turned his head, eyes searching the path ahead. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, he thought he saw them, two figures walking toward him. But then they veered off, disappearing down a different path. Ryan's heart sank. Maybe this was it. Maybe he'd have to live with the regret of never knowing. The camera pulls back as he sits, watching the empty path ahead, leaving the question of forgiveness and reunion hanging in the air, unresolved.